This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.
Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, a headline to a Sunday series in the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, spoke of a situation's harshness. A bleeding city, the headline says, followed by characterizing violence in New Orleans as a plague. New Orleans, we are reminded, has reclaimed the dreaded murder capital designation after an 11-year hiatus. From there, the series attempts to answer two questions. What are the causes? And what are the solutions? We will take a hard look at crime tonight, as well as other recent stories involving the police, including an investigation of the mayor's former security guard. Elsewhere, it has been a long time since there was daily rail service between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, but a strategic meeting this week gave hope that the railroad might be returning. And this being St. Patrick's Day, we will look at the historic role of the Irish politician. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, John Zimmerman, staff writer, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, and also Ben Myers, staff writer, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. Let's stick with Ben right now because you've been covering the issues surrounding police officer Vappy, who was part of Mayor Cantrell's security detail. And the story swirling around him, and of course the latest this week was the release of an audio file of his being interviewed by the Police Public Integrity Bureau. Okay, there's a lot there to unpack, so let's just start with the latest that you had today regarding Vappy's attorneys. Okay,
so first of all, yes, Vappy is under investigation by the Police Public Integrity Bureau for possible payroll irregularities. In the course of that investigation, he was interviewed, and then this week, recordings of that interview, as well as interviews with other members of the mayor's security detail, were leaked. This caused kind of a furor on its own, and Mr. Vappy's lawyers are now saying that this entire investigation is compromised, and that they're extremely disappointed.
Okay, so let's back up a little bit more too to remind our viewers about what this investigation into Officer Vappy is about, aside from, the payroll issue and his, claiming time to have worked when he was guarding the mayor.
Sure. Well, the controversy involves time spent alone with the mayor at a city-owned apartment that was documented in surveillance and in news reports. That is not what the investigation is strictly about. And in fact, in the recording, you can hear where the interviewer is starting to get into that, and the lawyer and Mr. Vappy's lawyers redirect it and say this is supposed to be narrowly focused on payroll issues. Mm-hmm. Of course, the two issues are intertwined, so in the public mind, it's sort of one issue.
Okay, let's go back to the recording now, to the report. It's a recording, really. Mm-hmm. The Public Integrity Bureau that's within the New Orleans Police Department is doing this investigation. Mm-hmm. How did this file end up in the hands of the New Orleans City Attorney, and should it have been? Should it ever go there?
That is undetermined in terms of how that happened. I think that we might find more out about that in coming days. Whether or not it should have been may be an open question or not, but I know that Council Member Giarrusso on that particular question of whether or not the city attorney should have had it has said that that was inappropriate. So why the city attorney had it and whether or not that was correct or not is still a question to be answered.
And also this investigation by the PAB is still ongoing, right?
It is ongoing as far as I know. And we don't really know where it's going.
And Vappy is not the only one that we hear on these tapes.
Correct. There's other members of the mayor's security detail who were interviewed as part of that. So,
But hasn't it been said that they got the recording from someone having to do with Hanno?
So the city attorney has issued a public statement acknowledging that it was an employee in the city attorney's office who accidentally disclosed this recording to a Hanno board member as part of a different proceeding.
Officer Jeffrey Vappy is on the board.
He was
on the board.
This is a whole other facet of this story, in that the mayor appointed Vappy to the Hanno board. And one of the things the investigators were looking at is the fact that he was being paid from his NOPD job and was on the clock basically while serving on this volunteer board.
And was the mayor present for these meetings?
No.
Okay, but he was still
He
charging
acknowledges-
for guarding the mayor while he was on the board.
He was being paid. I mean, he acknowledges in the interviews that he was on the clock.
Okay. Who at Hanno, do we know who at Hanno received this information?
I would say that Hanno and the Cantrell administration,
Can we just quickly qualify what Hanno is?
No.
Housing Authority of New Orleans.
Okay,
Yes.
thanks. Yeah, right.
They didn't name this person explicitly, but they have left no doubt that the person that they're saying received this was a board member named Sharon Jasper, who the Cantrell administration and the Hanno administration have both tried to remove unsuccessfully. They've been overridden by City Council on 2 occasions. Ms. Jasper released a statement today saying, just absolutely denying it, saying she had no knowledge of the recording or its release until she saw it in the news. So that's still to be determined.
Okay, council from the beginning has, or at least members of the council, like Giarrusso, said this really should be an outside party in doing this investigation.
Both Giarrusso and Morrell have said that, yes.
Is this investigation, is there an investigation anyplace else right now? I mean, is the Inspector General looking into this issue as well, do we know?
I can't say. I mean, on payroll is an issue within NOPD overall, as John would be able to speak about much better than I could. But, and I don't know if this is tied to anything.
Right. There's a federal investigation into details. Some officers are under federal investigation over double dipping. I believe most of the NOPD investigation has been resolved. There have been a few dozen officers who have been disciplined or given agreements or having to sign agreements.
Okay. As far as Vappy is concerned, he is still on the police department, is he right?
Yes, he's not on the mayor's detail anymore, nor is he on the Hanno board, but he hasn't been terminated as far as I know. Yeah.
Okay.
What was really surprising was his having been appointed to the Hanno board. I mean, it's really unusual for a police officer, especially a security guard, to be appointed to a board, and there wasn't much attention given to it. And he said he wanted to get more involved civically.
Yeah, I mean, I can't argue that it's unusual. He says in the interviews that he had a conversation with the mayor about what he'd like to do. He just recently got a master's degree in government administration, and he was having a discussion with the mayor about her giving him advice on how to still be a public servant after serving in the police department, and then she appointed him to the board.
Okay, so the investigation continues. All right. Thanks a lot, Ben. Okay, John, over to you. Over at the paper, you all have a series called The Bleeding City, which is a pretty provocative title, but, just has a lot of truth to it, unfortunately, and that's what you're looking at. And you can find it online if you haven't seen it yet. Go to NOLA.com, look under The Bleeding City, and the really, really compelling pieces that John has written about the state of affairs in the city and how we're losing so many young black males, particularly.
Yes, indeed. And as you said, we've regained our title as the nation's murder capital, at least for big cities. And this is a series, Bleeding City. This so far done 2 parts of it, and we'll continue to do more. The first one was really looking at the young black male population and how hard hit that population is in this city and sort of what it means from a public health standpoint. This one is more about a strategy that was used a decade ago, the last time the city was the nation's murder capital under Mitch Landrieu. And it's really focused on group violence. We're also were, as of recently, the leader in mass shootings, which kind of points to group violence a lot of times. We really looked at Central City, which was kind of the focus of what under NOLA for Life, which was Mitch Landrieu's kind of broad campaign against murder, but that he rolled out in 2012.
And explain what he did, what happened in the administration, which you point out in the article. Toward the end of his term in office, it sort of just kind of went away.
It did. This was a multi-agency gang unit that was stood up in 2012 and late 2012. It spawned a number of huge gang indictments, RICO-style indictments, whether in federal court or state court, focused on a lot of these gangs, mostly in Central City, which is a hotbed for violence from groups that hailed from the former housing projects in that area, the Melpomene and the Calliope and the Magnolia, and to some extent St. Thomas as well joined in that in Central City. So, and it remains one of the shootiest neighborhoods or worse. So this was a strategy that focused on these group dynamics and breaking up these groups. And there was some research afterward that showed it did have a pretty significant impact. We saw shootings go down, we saw murders go down, but that linked it up and said beyond other murder-prone cities, New Orleans saw a significant reduction that was credited to these prosecutions and that strategy.
And this was a multi-agency task force where you had state,
ATF,
local,
state,
feds working in there, and
local.
a lot wound up in court also.
And these big indictments, 12, 14, 20 defendants in single cases. That there were a lot of criticism around these cases too, that they cast a wide net and said about this jockeying for cooperation and questionable stories and kind of pitting all of these defendants against one another. So there's a lot of, people who are critical of that approach, certainly.
Well, fast forward to now,
Mm-hmm.
and the current interim superintendent with NOPD, she's taken a close look at that, is she not?
Well, yeah, in late January, Michelle Woodfork, who is our interim NOPD superintendent, came out with a crime plan of her own, and as part of that, she talked about some of the hallmarks of what happened back then. She talked about finding the 50 most dangerous or most violent criminals and developing their hierarchies and networks and using ATF ballistics tests to create matches and develop associations with violent criminals. Mm-hmm. So that that feels and sounds a lot like what took place a dozen years ago, where we have a police force that's 30% smaller, or something like that. So. How much that gets implemented and to what extent those ideas become indictments, we'll see. Jason Williams, mm-hmm. who is our DA, as a criminal defense attorney, represented some of those folks in those indictments. He has said that, they had an impact. For that time, they had a significant impact on, but he's not so sure it would work now. A lot of these beefs have moved online, which creates different problems for mm-hmm. investigators and for prosecutors who are trying to pin like a gang tag on a group of people. And
also, I saw in the quote that you have of him in the paper, in your article, about how now a big problem, of course, is car thefts and carjackings and guns, and how that's really a big issue now.
Correct. And also he mentioned the idea that adults are directing mm-hmm. youths to do some of these crimes. And that's something that we need to look harder at, and how much of that is going on and how much of that is causing the murders and all of the shootings that are continuing at a pretty much the same pace they have been in this whole 3-year surge.
Well, NOLA for Life. Oh, go ahead, E.
Now, there was a time when the city, I think with the best of intentions, really tried to develop public housing as a place to put the poor people together, but in one environment, to be able to work together and provide common services. And so you saw the development in New Orleans of what was called the housing projects. It wasn't a preferred word, but people talked about the projects, Desire projects, Magnolia projects. And then after several years, people said, well, this is the cause of crime, all this density of people in the same area. Let's do something different. So they started this new concept where they have these housing developments. Some of them look really nice. What is that? Where the Magnolia projects was, looks like a very
sure, but they're much smaller and much fewer people.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So all of those families and people dispersed, and so some of those dynamics, and plus Katrina, you throw that in, and then they disperse to different neighborhoods with people they're unfamiliar with, and it creates.
But has that had any impact? Has that changed anything?
Has what changed? Oh, the dispersal? Well, I mean,
Like,
Or the different housing approach, yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, you look at the course of murder, you look at the mid-90s, you could, I haven't sort of honed in on how much of that is project-related murder. But what this did, at least the research showed, was at least for a few years really knocked down shootings and knocked down murders. The studies didn't give it credit for the whole reduction that went all the way down to a 48-year-old low in 2019 because it went back up again.
So NOLA for Life, it really did focus on the gang activity. It would actually bring in
piece
people.
of NOLA for Life.
But
yeah.
pieces, yeah, okay. But they would actually bring in call-in sessions. Say, you really got to clean up your act, or
they would tell them, we know who you are.
Yeah.
They would show them pictures of themselves doing illegal things and talk about, we know who you are, we know you're friends with this person. It's sort of a scared straight kind of.
But in targeted gangs, but what kind of gangs do we have here? I mean, we're not talking about the national gangs. We use the word gangs, but is it
even
really?
Police now aren't really using that as a useful term, but from a legal standpoint, we still have gang racketeering charges that you can bring, so that's useful. But yeah, this is not Crips and Bloods. It's not it's not rules. There's not a lot of rules. There's not a lot of bosses. This is small groups of usually neighborhood young people who have allegiances to neighborhoods and form groups to protect each other. They're all some of these groups have a lot of weaponry, available to them now because there's sort of streets are awash in guns these days.
So go to the Cantrell administration, and she abandoned NOLA for Life, but she has her other projects that have happened. But what is happening? And I think you're going to take a closer look at that.
We are, and then we're going to look at that going forward in this, and what are these programs that are out there? What is the city doing? How much money is being spent compared to what other people who are having success are doing
in other communities?
Right.
Yeah, because it's certainly a problem, and it's just heartbreaking too, to read about the losses and how it's impacting families.
Right, because law enforcement is one piece of this. NOLA for Life was a lot bigger. It had a lot of social services and a lot of programs, and nonprofits were involved in that. But what seemed to have the biggest impact was this law enforcement
and
part.
He's holding his paper. Can we get a shot of it? Here's the headline, and it's Bleeding City. Can you see that? Okay, this is from what, the Sunday's paper?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So
Appreciate it.
when's our next installment?
Oh, when it gets done.
We're
We're going to roll these out through at least for several months.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thanks a lot, John. Okie dokie. Now we're going over to E and rail service between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. It's been
a little bit better
for a
news.
long time.
If you drive down the airline highway, the railroad track that goes along there that you've seen all your life, drive along there, that is the railroad tracks of the Kansas City Southern Railroad, and they're one of the major providers of rail service. And for a long time, in the days of passenger railroad, I mean, it's still busy with freight railroad, but in the days of passenger railroad, they operated a passenger train that went from New Orleans to Kansas City, called the Kansas City Southern, or the Southern Belle. But that was the train that took people through central Louisiana. You go from New Orleans up through Baton Rouge, up to the central part of the state, up through Shreveport, and then into Texas, and then towards Kansas City. So it was a very, very important train. Now, of course, once I-10 was built, there was less use of passenger trains. That line was closed in 1969. But there's still been this wish, gee, wouldn't it be something if we at least bring back the New Orleans to Baton Rouge service? And so during the week there was a meeting. Essentially, Canadian Pacific Railroad acquired Kansas City Southern and those tracks. And then part of the discussion is going to be that they're going to support bringing rail service back between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. The merger goes effect in April. The feeling seems very, very positive. Amtrak ranks it very high and thinks of what they're going to do. They still need to raise some money. One of the big expenses is the train bridge that goes over the Bonnie Carré Spillway. It's a long train bridge, but it's very old and it needs to be rebuilt. But thinking about it, I think, well, why would somebody from New Orleans, want to go and take a train to Baton Rouge? I mean, by the time you did all that, you could just drive. I think it works best the other way, from people from Baton Rouge coming in the direction of New Orleans, but in places along the way, like Gramercy and those towns. And people from New Orleans gone to somewhere other than downtown Baton Rouge, maybe like the Blue Bonnet X or those kind of things. But also one of the stops is going to be the airport. And so especially from people from upline, there's a regional airport in Baton Rouge, but there's nowhere you can get nonstop from a regional airport except maybe Houston. But somebody in Baton Rouge can take the train, to Armstrong Airport, and get a nonstop to Europe from there. And so the feeling is that this will do a lot to build the industrial corridor between the two. And so it's in progress. It's not definite yet, but people feel very, very encouraged that it will be coming. It used to be a big deal, like for LSU, Tulane football days.
Sure.
They'd be packed with students going back and forth. It'll be a good thing to see.
And so we have no idea maybe when we would see it, though.
No, but it seems like that there's good motion on it.
Okay. All right, E. Thanks a lot. All right, Ben, over to you. And I'm going to have you try to explain this to us. I don't know if it's possible, but short-term rentals in the city of New Orleans, what's the latest?
Okay, there's a huge vote on Thursday. And to explain that vote, I will briefly give a little history. There are two types of short-term rentals licenses in the city. One is commercial, one is residential. In August, a federal appeals court said that the residential license regime is unconstitutional because it discriminates against out-of-state owners. Reason being because the law requires residential license holders to live on site, we're talking about owners, and prove that with a homestead exemption. According to the court, the Constitution says that out-of-state owners need to be able to participate in this industry as well. So, and then there was a deadline put on the council to rewrite the law by the end of this month. So to get around that, the council has a new proposal that it will vote on Thursday that requires an operator to live on site, not necessarily an owner. It could be the owner. So that theoretically will allow, it would allow owners from other states to own a property and participate in the industry, theoretically satisfying the constitutional concern.
But somebody would have to be staying in there while it was being rented out.
Correct,
Okay.
yes.
All right. So coming up, well, also, I mean, there was also a recommendation to limit the number of permits, like one per block.
This is what the debate is actually about now,
Okay.
and it's sort of still in flux. The current proposal is for allowing one license per either side of the street called a block face, but there is a movement that got some support. And actually, this is what was initially passed, to have a much stricter restriction in which it would be one per square block, which is essentially it's 1/4 of the amount that were proposed before.
Who gets it? I mean, how is it determined who gets the permit?
Also up for to be determined. The proposal was for a lottery. A lot of smaller short-term rental residential license holders hated that idea because it's inevitably going to result in some of them losing their licenses. There might be some discussion now around just having it out as a first come, first serve basis. There's some concerns around that because typically it's understood that the people with the most resources would be able to take advantage of that.
Would anybody be grandfathered in?
I don't think that there's a strict grandfathering type of allowance being discussed, but there could be some other kind of way for like a conditional use to be granted to some if they have enough support from their neighbors. We'll see if that plays out.
Okay, and then of course there are zoning issues that are in there too, and we're not even on there right now. So.
Right.
Okay, we'll see what comes up next week. Thanks a lot, Ben.
Sure.
All righty, over to you to wrap us up. Irish politicians.
St. Patrick's Day, we thought to bring it up. There was a time in American history as you had all this European immigration that people were coming in, and there wasn't a lot of social services for them, but they actually themselves became a political force, especially like the Irish, as in New York, and then also New Orleans, and the Italians. And you saw that examples of both here with the Irish. They got together. Politics was a way of elevating yourself quickly. You didn't need a college degree. You didn't need a lot of background. All you needed was a lot of people that you can get together and organize a vote. And so you saw the emergence of the Irish politician. You can always point to neighborhoods in New Orleans, like in the Irish Channel. You had the Burke family, which was very powerful. It was the Burkes that started the St. Patrick's Day parade at the Stillport. In Mid-City, you had the Comiskey family. I remember there was a house on what was then Jeff Davis Boulevard. It was a big house with a big carport. And one night each week, Mr. Comiskey, Joe Comiskey, was sitting there like the Pope. And people would go and ask for indulgence and ask for, ask for political favors.
And other names?
Some of the Irish moved out into Lakeview. These were like the newer Irish. So you had the Fitzmaurices and the O'Keeffes and the McKays. And Michael O'Keefe became very, very powerful. He also got in political trouble too. But also Arthur O'Keefe was the mayor of New Orleans. And so he was the first Irishman. And then into Jefferson Parish, the Donlan family. For many, many years, politics in Jefferson Parish was, the Donlan faction versus the Cronford faction. And the Donlan faction always had somebody in office for maybe, 30, 40 years. And ironically, this week, Jim Donlan, who had been a nephew of Tom Donlan, announced he wouldn't run for re-election at the Insurance Commission. So that might be the last of the Donlans, at least for now. But the impact was just enormous over a long period of time.
Surely was. Tom Donlan, of course, a former president of Jefferson Parish, long term.
That's right, President.
Okie doke. Other stories, and we stick with you,
Next week is an election, a special election in District 93, which is part of the Central City area. It's a legislative election. It's really a bizarre election. If you pay attention to one of the candidates, by her own admission, spent time in prison along with her husband on the bank robbery charge. And they made a documentary of it, and they won an award for the documentary. But she has a good presentation, and so it's two unusual candidates in a very unusual election.
Okie doke. John.
Judge Jennifer Medley, Orleans Civil Court judge, today referred a recusal motion to the Supreme Court, so there will be an ad hoc judge likely appointed to hear a motion to recuse her on the basis that she earlier had signed the recall petition and then endorsed a deal that lowered the required vote count.
And of course, she's overseeing suits involving the recall.
One suit.
One suit, okay. Ben, over to you.
I'm very curious to see how this whole situation with the VAPI recording leak plays out. It's now touching a different issue involving Hanno. I don't know if it's going to go any further or not, but I'm very curious to find out.
All right, guys. Thanks a lot for being here around our table. Interesting conversation. Thank you all for joining us, too. We'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening and happy St. Pat's Day.
This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.